Hi friends, and welcome to the series, Walk Like Me. We're so glad that you're tuning in and you're going to follow us in this series. Walk Like Me is actually an invitation from Jesus out of the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, for us to walk like Him. And we'll be drawing out 4 themes in the course of this series. So last week, Sam talked about purpose and calling. Today, I'm going to talk about discipleship, and we're going to journey through the chapters of Luke really quickly and have a look at what Jesus shows us about discipleship. Obviously, He was the all-time best discipler of people that ever lived, and then called us to do the same. At the end of His life here on earth, He commissioned us to make disciples. And so we want to look through the book of Luke, all the chapters in Luke. There's this consistent theme of discipleship. He had His closest 3, He had His 12, He had His 72, and He had the crowds, and He was always discipling people. So we want to have a look at that in this week's episode. If you're tuning in from anywhere around the place, you can get in touch with us and join an online life group. We also meet physically, and I just want to give a shout out to our amazing life group leaders, our online life group leaders, and our local life group leaders who just do a brilliant job actually doing this, actually discipling people. So we're excited about this series and what it will bring to our lives. So discipleship. Today, I want to bring out the 5 C's of discipleship. So 5 C's, if you're taking notes, of what I've observed just skimming through and reading the book of Luke about how Jesus did discipleship. But before we get into it, what does discipleship mean? I've heard it defined as this, that discipleship is long commitment in the same direction. So 2 people committing to each other to walk in the same direction over a long term. That's what discipleship is. Discipleship requires relationship, but it also requires accountability. It requires honesty, vulnerability, transparency, availability. And so there are all these things that make up discipleship. It's more than just relationship. It's moving in a direction. It has a goal. It has a motive. And spiritual discipleship means that we're heading into Jesus, and that we're taking the person we're discipling into Jesus, or we're following someone into Jesus. So the 5 C's of discipleship. The first one I look at is the call. And when I look through the way that Jesus called His disciples, it's actually quite amazing. Very early on in the Gospel of Luke, we see that He actually said to a few people, "Come follow me." Now, He didn't say that to all 12. He only said it to a few people. Come follow me. And the first one was Simon, who He then called Peter, and he was a fisherman. And so he left everything he had and followed Jesus. And so did his colleagues. They did as well. The other fishermen, James and John. It says of all 3 of them, Peter, James, and John, they left everything and followed Jesus. And then we see Jesus walking up to a man named Levi, who was a tax collector. And He also said to Levi, "Come follow me." And he immediately left everything and followed Jesus. And so then we see a bunch of other things happen while we assume Jesus is hanging out with these 4 guys. But we learn in chapter 6 that He'd actually rallied a whole group of people. A big crowd were now following Him and being His disciples. But in chapter 6, He actually picks 12 out of the crowd. Now, the first 4 were Simon, Peter, James and John, and Levi, who was also called Matthew. But it lists there in chapter 6 the others that Jesus called out of that bigger crowd that made up His 12. In chapter 8, it tells us that women were actually disciples as well, and that those women funded Jesus' ministry, which is pretty amazing. And I love the heart of a woman, that generous heart that funds the things of God. And so we see Jesus discipling His 12, 72, we see Him discipling men, women, and people of all ages and backgrounds. Many of them had very, very questionable backgrounds, which is good news for you and me. I don't know if that's good news for you. It's definitely good news for me that Jesus calls all sorts of people, and He does that. It's a call. And I want to ask you today, whether you're leading this life group or whether you're attending this life group, have you heard the call? That call, that voice of the Spirit calling you, saying, come follow me. Come follow me. And as we move on from that question is, will you pay the price? Because what we see is that Simon, James, and John and Levi left everything to follow Jesus. There's a cost. There's a cost involved in discipleship. And in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus specifically talks about the cost at least twice. He says in chapter 9 and chapter 14 that there's a specific cost associated with discipleship. And he says you need to deny yourself, you need to take up your cross and follow me. Deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. There is a cost to discipleship. There's a cost. It's more than just hanging out. It's more than just social activity. There's a cost to discipleship. And that immediate response is what qualifies us. That response that says, you know what? I'm going to leave everything and follow Jesus. In Luke chapter 9, when he's talking about the cost, there is a verse in there that has actually been a life verse for me for a really long time. It says this in verse 62. It says, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. Jesus is saying you need to take up your cross, you need to deny yourself and don't look back. Press into the things that I have ahead of you. This is the cost. The unfortunate thing, and this is quite remarkable, in Luke 18, Jesus approaches another young man and he uses that question, that invitation. He says, come follow me to this young man. Now notice, this phrase had only been used 4 times before this guy. 4 people prior to them had had that specific invitation. Only 4. Come follow me. But this guy, he's called the rich young ruler in Luke 18. And Jesus says, you know what? You need to give up everything you have and come follow me. And the rich young ruler walks away sad and denies an invitation from Jesus. All of us come to a place where we have to count the cost. Jesus then turns around and tries to explain, you know what? You need to count the cost because there is a cost. And you need to be able to be willing to pay that cost. And what a privilege it is, though, to pay it. What a privilege it is to step into a discipleship relationship with Jesus, but also with others, and pay the price of vulnerability and accountability and being stretched and grown and moved in the direction of our potential in Jesus. I remember all through my Christian life, I've sought out coaches and mentors and disciplers. And one particular lady I asked to mentor me, I could only meet with her once every 6 months because of the amount of things that she would give me that would stretch me to a place that I knew I needed time to practically outwork what was going on, what she was asking me to do and drawing me into. There are other relationships I've had where I've gleaned on a weekly basis or I've observed, but there's always a cost, and that cost is I'm leaning in to be taught. I'm leaning in. I'm actually going to give up the things that I'm familiar with, the things that maybe gives me comfort or security, because that's not going to grow me. You know, my potential is on the other side of my challenge, on the other side of my discomfort, on the other side of the cost. It's always on the other side of what's inconvenient. And so it is a privilege to pay that cost. The third C that I see in Jesus' method of discipleship in the book of Luke is this coaching that takes place. The coaching that takes place. The disciples had this amazing privilege that no one else had. And that was to ask questions. You know, they could actually pull Jesus aside and ask him questions. Often he would tell a parable and the disciples would pull him aside later and go, what did you mean by that? And he would explain it to them. They asked him, hey, Jesus, can you teach us how to pray? What an amazing request to be able to ask, you know, the Son of God, teach us how to pray. There were times when they pulled Jesus aside because he could do stuff that they couldn't. Do you remember the time when the father brought his son to Jesus because he was possessed? And he brought him to Jesus after having taken him to the disciples, and the disciples couldn't help the situation. And Jesus just intervenes and he fixes the situation, delivers this young boy, and later the disciples are like, how did you do that? And so this amazing opportunity for this coaching that takes place. But you know what? Also in the coaching, there's bonus content. There's bonus content when you're being coached by somebody. There are so many times, I encourage you as you're reading the book of Luke to actually take note of just how many times it says, and then Jesus said to his disciples. So he teaches the crowd, he teaches the masses, but there are so many instances where, and then Jesus said to his disciples. Extra tutorials, follow-up parables, deeper explanations. He taught them systems. Do you remember that time when he said that they come to him and say, Jesus, the people are hungry, send them away. And he says, no, you provide for them. And they freak out because there's more than 5,000 people. How are we supposed to feed 5,000 people? And he says to them, get them to sit in groups of 50 and then provide for them. He teaches them how to systemize a miracle. He teaches all this bonus content. He has intercessory moments for them. He says to Peter at the end, when Peter's about to betray him, Peter's about to deny him, he says to him, Peter, I've prayed for you. I prayed that your faith would stay strong. How amazing. Just consider having yourself in a discipleship relationship where the person who's leading you intercedes for you. The person who's leading you prays for you in your moment of need. And this same Peter, who just comes up a lot in the Gospels, this guy, I call him Captain Obvious. You know, the amount of times that he just bumps into Jesus and either says something inappropriate or totally wrong or really obvious. Like Jesus is walking through a crowd, a woman touches him, and he feels the power go out of him. So he turns around and he says, who touches me? And Peter goes, Jesus, everybody's touching you. He's Captain Obvious. He has this access to him that not everybody has. So there's this bonus content that we have in discipleship relationships. There's also secret missions that we see Jesus send his disciples on. How many times did Jesus say to his disciples, go and see a man about a thing? So many times, go and see a man about a thing. He'd already made provisions and he was sending his disciples to go ahead and do that. What about the secret mission of the storm on the lake? They get into a boat and Jesus says, let's cross over to the other side. And he falls asleep while a storm erupts and they wake him. And Jesus is like, how can you have such little faith? Didn't I say to you, let's go to the other side? Can I tell you, if God said, let's go to the other side, we're going to the other side, regardless of what happens in the middle. And so these secret missions where we learn, not to question in the storm what God said in the calm. These are these secret missions that we have in discipleship relationships. The rooms of faith, the secret mission of a room of faith. There is that amazing, amazing story of Jairus' daughter who has passed away. And Jesus is invited into the room to bring healing to her body. She's lifeless in the bed, and Jesus actually pulls in 3 of his disciples into that room. 3 out of the 12 are invited into that secret mission. I often, when I read that, my heart just yearns to know, would I be one of the 3 that was invited in, or would I be one of the 9 that was left outside? Those secret moments where we're being stretched and grown, and in the challenges that Jesus puts right in front of us. Jesus says, 5,000 people, send them away. He goes, no, you fix the problem. You provide for them. These are all secret missions that Jesus brings us on. And when we're in discipleship relationships, these people in our lives bring us on these missions and challenge us and stretch us. And we have access to the things of God that not everybody does. The secret prayer. How many times did Jesus invite the disciples to come and pray with him? He pulled away so many times to pray, and they were always with him in those secret places. They saw him transfigured. They saw him speaking with Moses and Elijah. They saw all these amazing opportunities in those coaching sessions. When we come into discipleship relationships, We actually allow ourselves to be developed in a way that the masses are actually avoiding, they're not willing to step into, but discipleship relationships allow us to step into more through coaching. The fourth C of discipleship that I notice as I read this very, very human, transcript of people interacting with Jesus is the conflict. His disciples so many times wrestled with an inner conflict. And I want to tell you, when you're in a discipleship relationship, there is going to be inner conflict within you. There are going to be times where you don't know what you're going to do, how you're going to respond, whether you even agree. There are going to be times when your flesh and your humanity wars against the God potential on the inside of you. There's a conflict. It says often in Luke that they were actually afraid of Jesus. They were afraid to ask him questions sometimes. As available as he was, Jesus, teach us how to pray. Why didn't we do what you could do? How do we do that? What did you mean by that? There were also times where they were like, whoa, this guy means business. And they were afraid. There were other times, over and over actually, we see in chapter 9 and chapter 22, where the disciples are all sitting around wondering what the hierarchy order of the 12 of them is. Who is the best out of the lot? Who's the greatest? And so in chapter 9 and chapter 22, Jesus catches them out fighting over prominence. And he reminds them again, hey, significance is the goal, not prominence. He reminds them again of the order of the kingdom of God. And so there's going to be this war, this conflict on the inside of us. What I love in Luke 17 verse 5, their beautiful response in a moment of conflict, personal conflict, is, you know what, Lord? Increase our faith. And I have to tell you that I've been in relationships where I've had the opportunity to disciple people. And that response is a beautiful response. You know what? I'm challenged by that. But I pray that my faith can grow to step into what you're saying, to step into what you're challenging me to do. And Jesus told them at the end of chapter 22, when they were arguing about who was going to be the greatest, he actually answered that question in such a challenging way. In verses 28 to 29, Jesus told them that because they had walked the trials with him, because they had paid the price with him, that he would assign eternal rewards for them. So those inner conflicts, do you know what? They're always worth paying the price. They're always worth stepping into and pressing into. And discipleship challenges us. Discipleship raises inner conflict within us. But Jesus says, because you walk these trials, there are eternal rewards for you. What about Peter's spectacular denial in chapter 22? Talk about an inner conflict. This is Peter, Captain Obvious, who we talked about just before. This is the guy who was all in. This is the guy that Jesus pulled into the miracle room and said, Peter, I want your faith by my side when I believe for this girl. This is this guy. This guy denies Jesus 3 times in the most heartbreaking way, and yet is completely restored again and ends up being one of the ones that builds the early church. It's an amazing thing, this conflict. And I want to challenge all of us, just as I am challenged in my own humanity, to rise up to the conflict, to press through the conflict, to step into the fullness of God and walk the trial in faithfulness, walk the trial of discipleship. Remember, it's long commitment in the same direction. So when conflict arises, remember the commitment you made and step into that. And the next C, the final C, is the commission. So Jesus actually commissions his disciples several times through the gospel. It's not just at the end after he ascends. It's actually several times through the gospels, and in chapter 9 of Luke and in chapter 10. So in chapter 9, he sends out his 12, his immediate 12. And he sends them out and he says, I am giving you power and authority over demons and disease. Now go and preach the good news, heal the sick, and cast out demons. Go. And they go. And then we see in chapter 10 that he sends out the 72. So the very next chapter, he's sending out the bigger group to do the same thing. And what's awesome is that they come back in chapter 10 and they're so excited and they give a report. And the report is about all the miracles that they'd seen, all the salvations that they'd seen, all the amazing transformations that they'd seen. And Jesus celebrates with them. He celebrates with them. And this is the thing, the most amazing celebration that I've been a part of is a missional celebration. There are so many things we can celebrate. But what about the things of eternal value? What about that time when I can celebrate with you about the things of God you've stepped into, the victory that you stepped into when you challenged yourself and you crossed the line and you saw a victory, and then that ongoing coaching as they came back to him and said, this is what happened. And he's like, that is amazing. Ongoing coaching all the time. And so that commission, because we're going through the book of Luke, but in Acts, which was also written by Luke, we see Jesus' last words to his disciples. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Luke writes a record of Jesus' words. He says, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. The commission, the final C of discipleship. And this is the thing, we're all commissioned to make disciples. We're all commissioned to bring someone alongside us. We often say, have a hand up and have a hand down. Make sure someone is really actually speaking into your life. One person, someone who is like a father, someone who is going to be stretching you and challenging you, not 100 different voices, not peers, not friends, someone who is actually going to be discipling you, and then a hand down. No matter how long you've been on this journey, if you've been on this journey with Jesus for more than a day, you have something to offer someone else. So always be pouring yourself into others as well, speaking that faith language, speaking that kingdom language, speaking that victory language into someone else's life. Because when the power of the Holy Spirit comes on us, that's its purpose, to make disciples of all nations, from the nearest to the furthest, that we would reach out and make disciples. So, my friends, that's it for the discipleship component of the book of Luke, the 5 C's of discipleship. I want to encourage you now to do your own study, to have a chat in your life groups. Make sure you connect with us online if you want to connect in an online life group or a natural physical life group. And just connect with us. Send in your testimonies. Let us know what's happening in your life. Make sure you're not doing this journey alone. We're meant to be in relationship together. We're going to cross to a testimony now of some of the amazing things that God is doing in the life of our church and in the life of believers as we press into God and love God together. And we want to see you again on the next episode of Walk Like Me.
Hi, my name is Mark. This is my wife Jasmine, and I'll probably say we've probably believed in God our whole lives, but He's really only become a reality to us in the past 6 years.
Yeah, so when Mark and I first met, we had a challenging relationship. We were just two broken people put together by God through the bad, good, flaws and all. And He just made it work for us because God just knew that we couldn't do relationship any other way.
But over these past 6 years, we've seen the hand of God move like nothing else. We have 4 amazing children that all attend church, that all come to learn what us as adults, that we've just found out about God 6 years ago, they get to learn now. And it's so great because you can just see their future. It's just going to blossom because they're just being in church. So that's the best thing that could ever happen to us, I think, our family. And it can even work through little things such as just getting a job, because I remember the time I first attended church was COC at the time, and we were really in a bad state with finances and things. And that day I got home, got a phone call, said I was starting the next day. That was amazing. That was a great day because I was just in awe that God is real, and I think a lot of people look for that kind of thing. That Like, whoa, no one could do this, only something supernatural, you know, only something that, you know, the world cannot see, but, you know, but Jesus done that, yeah.
I couldn't tell you how different our lives are, our marriage, our relationship, and my children. And my children get to walk in the blessings, the salvation that we both walk in now, and in our walk with God.
Knowing God is not knowing Him personally, you know, but His ways are paths to blessing, healing, restoration, and freedom.
Freedom.
Agree?